brain, self, and art. A happy marriage. We're thinking about how is it possible that our brain can yield such wonderful creative works like art, painting, poetry, acting. And since our mind yields these kind of creative art, the question is, how are brain and mind connected? And this is a question which is really not yet clear in current science. And it's a little bit like when you see on the first slide, like Frankenstein. And there's a deep truth to the question Frankenstein wanted to yield a mind. When we speak of mind, we often just look at the surface, what we can see from the outside. That's emotion, cognition, perception, movements. However, the question is, maybe there's a deeper layer to the mind, just like an iceberg. An iceberg has a surface. That's what we all see. And that's what the current science, and also the science of the brain, neuroscience, mainly focuses on. That, however, neglects the deeper layer of the iceberg, because that's the fundament of the iceberg. However, that is hidden deep in the water. And important, it directly edges with the water. These deeper layers, as I claim, are the secrets to the mind, and therefore also to art. Now, when you see a painting or a beautiful piece of music, it connects you. You feel synchronized, you feel part of it. Yeah? You're immersed into it. Question, how does the artist create that? It's unbelievable. My claim is ultimately that the artists know the brain much better than many of the neuroscientists. That's the main topic of my talk, the deeper layers of brain and mind and the deeper layers of art. First question, from a neuroscientific point of view, I need to address how are brain and mind connected. Next slide. What we currently know, we know a lot about the brain. You see all these colorful pictures and cognition is here, attention is here, racism is here, and so on and so forth. However, you, as an outsider to the science, might ask, what about my experience? I listened to you, Dr. Northoff. It's terribly boring. I have a feeling of boredom. You can't explain where this feeling, this experience is coming from. However, when I see a work of art, like a Da Vinci painting, I get goosebumps. Dr. Northoff, explain me where and how my experience of goosebumps is coming from. How is it generated? This deeper layer of art. And this connection, we don't know yet. That's why we can speak of a gap of contingency. We don't know the relation between brain and mind, what connects them. Let's look into nature. Always a good idea. For centuries, philosophers said, the mind is special. It's something related to some metaphysics. Earlier time, it was God. We had a special connection to God. No. Let's look something completely non-special. For instance, follow Darwin. Before Darwin, everybody said human species are special. Darwin said, no, they're not special at all. They just follow the same kind of evolutionary trajectories as other species. Same here. the mind may not be special, but it may just be based on basic features of nature. Look, for instance, this beautiful quote by Nikola Tesla. He's an engineer, turned 19th, 20th century, came from former Yugoslavia to New York, and look at his Google. Very interesting person. It is no wonder that Elon Musk, whatever you think about him, named his cars Tesla. He had a beautiful quote. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. That's exactly what I do for the mind, and I will also show you later the same for arts and painting. So the main idea is maybe these basic features, energy, frequency, vibration, basically you can subsume under the umbrella of dynamics. For instance, dynamics is the pattern of change, what I'm doing now with my movements here. I'm moving here, I'm moving here. It's a rather slow dynamic, but I can also move much faster. That's a faster dynamic. So the claim is that the dynamics links brain and mind, neuronal and mental activity. Consider your experience. Your experience is not static. It fluctuates. Yeah, in bigger waves, smaller waves, more powerful, less powerful. And I will show you that the same principles, amazingly, also operate in paintings. And I'm sure one can make also the case for acting performances. Dynamics is the key of acting. So the key features are time and space. What do I mean by time and space? I don't want to go into philosophy here, but at least I want to give you a brief hint. The neuroscientists these days usually consider time and space as only out there in the world, outer time and space. And then they investigate what kind of neuronal mechanisms we have when we perceive the outer time, there something changes, or the space, like the movement of the camera. However, that is to assume that the brain itself is empty. It's an empty box. And that's not the case. The brain is a very active organ. It constructs its own inner space and time. It has its own inner waves and its own inner topography. I will come back to that. And interestingly, this distinction between inner and outer time goes back to a very famous philosopher, Immanuel Kant, in the 18th, 19th century. So in this inner time and space, the brain constructs a sort of a virtual time and space. We cannot observe it as such at each time point. And you will see that this notion of virtual inner time and space is key also for my view of art. So here on the right, I give you an example. The upper right, the waves. Look to the seaside. I know Berlin is not that close, but it's also not that far. Go to the Baltic, and you see waves. You see big waves, very powerful waves. As a surfer, you want those waves. Why? Because these waves are powerful. They are powerful, they have dynamics, and they carry you force and give you speed. And then there are small waves, fast waves. You don't want those because they finished early and you cannot really surf on them. However, and this is very important and often neglected, now you might say, how do these waves? Yes, there are some waves in the brain, but come on, Northoff. They're not related to my experience. but they are, because your experience continuously fluctuates. And important, your brain's inner wave align to the outer wave of the environment. I give you an example. When you listen to music, you unconsciously tap the rhythm of the music with your feet or with your finger. And you feel a flow. You're in a good mood, you feel synchronized. You align your inner time to the outer time of the music. And if you're very depressed, you're too slow, you cannot follow the music. The same with the surfer. It's a brilliant example. The surfer adapts her or his movements and the dynamic of the movements to the dynamic of the waves. And the better the wave will propel the surfer, and the more the surfer has a feeling of groove. And very interestingly, I spoke with many surfers. Before they go with their surfboard into the waves, they observe the waves and try to prepare basically a mental image of the waves, how they have to go with the waves. So they tune their brain waves to the water waves. So the idea is that these waves and the spatial organization of these waves, where they go in the right and the left, / topography, are key in linking neuronal and mental states. They provide what I like to say as a common currency. What do I mean by that? As a Canadian, I'm really impressed here in Europe. You have the euro, you travel from country to country, you have the same currency, your passports are not controlled at all. Yeah? So you have the common currency, the euro, and you can interact everywhere and you can connect. Otherwise, this would not be possible. Same here. It's like water. In Canada, you have a lot of ice. In the winter, you have also some vapor, steam, and you have fluid water. If you weren't knowing that these three states are all related to water, or /H2O, the chemical formula, you would say these are three different chemicals. Same here. Neuronal and mental states are just different space-time configurations, the same, and they share that. Yeah? As I said, the neuronal dynamic translates into mental dynamics. That's why I speak of a common currency. Now, I would like to give you a little bit more concrete example now, the sense of self, and how the brain constructs a sense of self. There is an eternal, perennial discussion about what the self is. Philosophers have discussed this, now neuroscientists, so there's an abundance of definitions of self. I want to spare you that. But what is important, what I mean, there's a sense of self. You wake up in the morning, you look into the mirror, you say, yeah, and you probably have a feeling, yeah, this is me. And recently, we had a new apartment, and there were no mirrors. And every morning I looked into the mirror, and no mirror, can't see myself. It's a real problem. If you undergo this over many weeks, and I'm not a Dorian Gray, at least I hope so, it's really interesting. But you see a sense of self, and that's what I mean, this experience of self. Yeah? And that sense of self can go awfully wrong, because I'm also a psychiatrist, and I've seen several patients who took on the identity of another person, and usually famous persons. So I had the privilege of meeting Mao, Stalin, whether it's a privilege or not, Nefertiti, yeah, and other famous people. And interestingly, it has a strong cultural context. Jesus was also among them. So that means there must be certain processes how your brain and body construct your sense of self. And the question, how do these construction processes work? So first I want to show you a brief idea how the brain constructs its own space, inner space, the relationship between the regions, its topography, such that we can generate a sense of self. So the self is obviously has many facets. My body, my outer body, we call this extroceptive in neuroscience, is a key part of myself, the shape of my body, and so on and so forth. When you go to the gym, your shape changes, and of course this becomes part of yourself, and you show it. Then there's also your inner body, your interoceptive, your stomach, and your feelings, how you feel. Certain people are very sensitive. Breathing, something I explore now more and more. In my early morning gymnastics, I do a long breath holds, and I feel my whole body is basically gets fresh air, the breathing in and out. So there's also an interoceptive, and that's myself. And then there's also, that's called the bodily self, and the outer self is the outer bodily self. And then there's also your mental self. So when you have a lot of thoughts and you think about yourself and you have ruminations and all kinds of thoughts, it's very mental. So in what we observed in various studies, that these three kinds of self somehow have different regions in the brain, but also overlapping regions in the brain. So they're basically like, in that example will come very often now, like the Russian dolls. You have a smaller Russian doll, you have a larger one, and you have a yet larger one. And that means that, for instance, the regions of the inner body self are also recapitulated by the regions of the mental self, plus some additional regions. So it's real like a Russian doll sitting there in our brain. That's this particular spatial organization, or what we say, topography. And that's also in your experience of yourself. Because you never feel your mental self detached from the bodily self and vice versa. You have certain thoughts, but then you have also bodily feelings in the background of those thoughts. It's a balance. Yeah? Just like when you see the small Russian dolls, you already know something about the bigger Russian dolls. You don't know the exact size, but somehow they're lurking in the background when you see the small Russian dolls. Same here. These three different layers of self, mental, inner body, outer body, they're somewhat nested within each other, like the Russian dolls. And here I show that again. Here I also now finally show the Russian dolls, and you see these three circles, you really see the nestedness. We do not also have to go to the Russian dolls. There's also the Chinese crystal ball. It is amazing when you see this. These are the same size little balls, same shape balls, but different sizes, and I don't know, I think 100 of these little balls nested within each other. It's incredible. The Russians cannot compete with that kind of craftsmanship of the Chinese here. So here you see it's a basic organization, spatial topographic organization within the brain itself, and that gives you a sense of self. And you can link this also to concepts which you probably heard of from Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis. Remember the superego, that's your mental self, and your it and your ego. So you can see there's a direct link between neuroscientific, the spatial organization of your brain, and your psychodynamic features well described. Now you say, how about time? Time is for me personally the most interesting feature. Because time, and when I speak of time, I mean dynamics, movement. You see, I move. And I move now in different ways. I know I make it difficult for the camera now. I move slow, fast, I can move regular, and I can also move irregular, and I can also change the direction. You see the different variations of time. And that's exactly these kinds of variations of time you also see in your brain's neuronal activity and also in your mind. Your thoughts are sometimes racing. When you're very anxious, your thoughts are racing like crazy. And when you're extremely depressed, maybe your thoughts stand almost still. And you also don't move. And your perceptions are too slow. You cannot follow the fast movements. Here you see that extreme mental states, like anxiety or depression, might be traced to abnormal temporal configurations or abnormal tempodynamic in the brain. And that's exactly what we showed. And now we use that for diagnosis and also for therapy. But let me come back to my topic of the self here. You heard it already. Northoff is all about time, and time is all about waves. Waves, dynamic fluctuation. Here I show you the brain has waves in different speeds, very slow waves, you see at the bottom, very fast waves at the top. We can measure these waves with different kind of methods, technologies, brain imaging methods, but that doesn't really matter now. So when you consider the brain, it's dynamic, it's more or less like when you go to a seaside. Sometimes there's more wind, less wind. That depends, of course, on the environmental context of the brain, and there's all these different waves. And very important, as I indicated earlier, the slow waves have a lot of power. You're afraid that the slow waves might smash you back to the beach. The faster waves, you say, you don't care. They don't have much power. Same in the case of the brain and the mind. If you have slower thoughts, like in depression, they can be extremely powerful and you cannot get rid of them. They impose themselves upon you, and that's what we call rumination. And they circulate, and you have no chance of escaping. I heard that from many patients. However, when I have faster thoughts, then they're a little lighter, they don't impose, they're not as powerful. And I can distance myself, I can distract myself. And if they become really fast, then that's what the psychiatrist calls mania. And that's in a way very brutal for the patient, because finally the patient has fast thoughts and is happy, and then the psychiatrist comes out, mania. And this is what I want to say. Our self is just like the waves. We showed this on both in the experience of self as well as in the brain, that the constellation between slower waves and fast waves is directly related to your sense of self. If you have less slower and powerful waves in your brain, your self-consciousness and experience is rather weak. Yeah? Because you lack the powerful slow waves, the foundation. If in contrast, you have relatively stronger, slower waves, you have more power, but still also the fast waves, then you have a very healthy self and you have a balanced self. Now, when you have only the fast waves without the slow waves, then you might approach mania and you might lose yourself. And that's exactly what many of the manic patients tell me. If in contrast you have only the slow waves, but not the fast waves, you're severely depressed. You're locked into the power of these slow waves, and as I said, already indicated, you suffer from these thoughts that constantly impose themselves upon you. Like the very powerful wave that basically smashes you right away to the beach. time and space, how the brain time and space constructs its own inner time and space, shapes your emotions, shapes your cognition and your consciousness. There's always a temporal and a spatial envelope around that. Finally, I come to the main topic after such a long prelude. Now, about art. How is brain-mind, the spatial temporal features of brain-mind, related to art? And I choose here the example of painting. I could have also made the example of music or acting. Look at this painting. You all know this. It's The Last Supper, Da Vinci in Milano. When you look at this painting, you have the feeling it's a 3D. You have the feeling you're part of this room. It's a 2D canvas. Are you psychotic? No, because Da Vinci paints it in such a way that you become part of the room and that you perceive a 3D room. Incredible. So he extends a 2D canvas into a virtual 3D space. Now, look at the apostles. They're all different. And you have the feeling this is just a snapshot. When you would look a millisecond later, you would think there's a different painting there. Are you psychotic? The painting is static. There's no movement in there. He creates it by the way he paints it. So he creates a virtual dynamic, a virtual space. And that's exactly, as I said, what our brain also does. That's what we experience in our consciousness of self and our experience of self. It's a virtual time and space. So here's another painting, and I want to have, it's a personal experience. When was it? I think 2 years ago. Was the first trip after the COVID. And so I was invited in Madrid to speak at the Prado, at the main museum there. And they showed me also around. And one painting particularly caught my attention. I was basically standing, came from the distance, thought the painting had this is not a painting. These are real objects, people standing out, like these cars when you see sometimes in modern galleries, they really put a car there. And that's exactly the way this painting looked like. I said, this is unbelievable. I said, this is not a painting. So particularly when you moved away from the distance, it really looked like a 3D, like real. Yeah, so I thought it's a modern painting. Of course, in the Prado, you have mainly painting from earlier times. So I thought, how is this possible? So and then it really got me, how do the painters create a virtual time and space? For instance, it's a 3D. You have really, when you see it in the Prado from the distance, you have the feeling it's a 3D thing. So how do they do that? So, and then I went into that because that's basically the same what we have in our mind. We have a virtual time and space experience. So, and then I said, maybe as a neuroscientist, I can learn something from the painters. How on earth do they do that? For instance, you know that Leonardo da Vinci studied human anatomy extremely in detail. Unbelievable. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to see how, for instance, the human eye, based on its anatomy in brain and the eye, perceives. And then he wanted to paint accordingly. So he knew exactly how people perceive based on his anatomical studies, and then perceived and basically fooled them into perceiving a virtual 3D space. So one example, for instance, is that when you look at the lines of The Last Supper or any other painting of his, he has never straight lines. It is always fluctuating lines. Why does he do that? Because he says that our perceptual apparatus always perceives fluctuating lines. We cannot perceive, really experience, straight lines. Why is that so? Because the brain itself, in its activity, continuously fluctuates. So if we have a fluctuating object in the environment, then that matches very well with the fluctuation of the brain, and we can perceive it. It's like, again, remember my earlier example, the dancing. You synchronize. If I have the right frequencies and speed in my brain and can well align to the speed of the music, I tap and I feel a groove. Yeah? And I become ideally part of the music itself. And that's, of course, the best state. I love that. And I'm sure many others too. And that does not only go for music, that goes for everybody, has her or his own field and matter here. So, and however, if the fluctuations in your brain do not match with the fluctuations in the painting or in the music, then there's a mismatch. You cannot align or synchronize, and that means you don't feel it. You don't experience it. Yeah? So experience is for me very important. Alignment, both personally and neuroscientifically. How, for instance, do they create this 3D space? One thing is, for instance, you see this in the Da Vinci painting, foreground, background. He has a more light color for the foreground and a brighter color for the foreground and a more darker color in the background. So they distinguish, and that creates a virtual space that they distinguish. Look at the Mona Lisa. You see a stronger color in the foreground, and then you see a landscape in the background, and even better, you see a river flowing from the mountains towards her, completely crazy. But that creates dynamic. So she is embedded in a context. It's unbelievable when you look at the paintings under this spatial temple aspect. Yeah, and that's my view of the world by now. In the Prado painting, which I showed you also, the Van Weyden painting, there he has he creates lines and then he interrupts the line by some body parts. That creates a 3D, a virtual space, a virtual dynamic. And that's exactly what our mind is about. It's a virtual experience. We experience the world in a word, it's like a 3D virtual reality in a way. That's what our brain creates. But it always aligns to the world. So, a key point, and then I'm close to the end of my talk, is the point of view. The good painter creates a virtual point of view, and even better, with that point of view, he pulls you into that point of view. So you are part of the painting. Yeah? You are part of the music. Many musicians told me the music executes itself through them when they're really in a good flow state. How is that possible? That our brain aligns itself to, for instance, then the music or the painting. How is that possible? That it basically aligns its own point of view. And that different layers again. Of course, I can say I have a mental point of view. Here is me, here is you. We are completely different. We are not connected. That can be described as a mental point of view. However, there's a deeper layer where we are connected. And that's less on the verbal level, it's more on the experience level. And that's exactly the level where good art starts. Experience, it creates a connection between you and the music piece. My partner is a composer. And I often tell him, because he knows exactly how to pull the people into his music, that they have no choice but to follow and listen and become part of the music, and then they experience the groove of the music. And I often say, he knows the brain much better than I do. because he knows, like Da Vinci, how to play with people's perception and to make them perceive a melody, because he just composes some notes. It's nothing else. He doesn't compose a melody in that sense. Yeah, he just puts some notes there. But your brain puts that together as a melody. So that means our brain, what happens in our brain, it's not just inside, it's always related to the environmental context. We are always aligned, synchronized to a lower or higher degree. And changes in this kind of alignment leads you to me as a psychiatrist. So there is what I like to describe as a neuroecological point of view, or neurosocial. So your brain always becomes part of the wider environment. And that's what consciousness and experience are about. You experience yourself as part of the wider context. For instance, I now experience myself as part of this wonderful hall. So our brain is part of the wider world, and that's a point of view. So it's very important, because this is often neglected, because often it's just here in the brain. The brain is objectively here in the skull, but it's virtually always connected to the environmental context. And that gives you experience and feeling. And that's what your experience is about. And important that this point of view is temporal. Remember, the surfer adapts and aligns its own movements to the movements of the waves. So there's a direct temporal connection. So we are temporally anchored in the world. And one can literally investigate that also in the brain, that the temporal waves of the brain, that's why I like to speak of neurowaves, are very much aligned with what you can call world wave. Here is that again, and this is important. Remember, I showed the example of the iceberg. There's a deeper layer. This deeper layer is this anchoring of the brain in the world. It's exactly like a ship is anchored through its lower part in the sea. And that makes the ship going. Otherwise, if we're only the upper part, would not work. Come back, my beloved iceberg example. The deeper layer of the iceberg, the deeper layers of the brain, like the iceberg directly aligns to the surrounding water, the world aligns directly to the external environment. And the better you create that relation, that's for me art. And that goes through temporal connections. So I think it's a deeper layer which we often neglect, looks almost trivial, time and space, but so important because it shapes our experience and, as I would say, also the creative art. That's why I like to speak of neurowaves. Neurowaves are key for our experience and for our mental well-being and for art. Thank you very much.